You guys curious at all to what I'm going to be talking about today? If you think I'm going to be talking about a travel video, you're right. Because today I'm talking about the time I spent in Thailand. So I spent about a week in Thailand, 5 days actually visiting places, 2.5 days traveling. My main goals, I really wanted to go see Maya Bay from what I saw online, and there's the movies made about it. But right after I booked the whole trip to go down to see it, I learned that the beach itself had actually been closed because Netflix released a documentary showing how dirty this area was, so the government of Thailand shut down the island that it sits on so that tourists and locals couldn't go and pollute anymore, so they could take time to clean it up. But one of the things you really want to remember when you're traveling in a different country is that the language barrier in some places can be a real thing. Now, when I was in Thailand, when I was trying to get to the islands that Maya Bay is at, they're the Phi-Phi Islands, or Phi-Phi I think it's probably pronounced. Phi-Phi sounds a lot funnier. But the travel agency I was working with, they made it sound like I was going to get a round trip ticket to where I was staying, then the ride to the ferry dock, then a round trip ferry ticket for where I was going afterwards. And it wasn't until after I got on the ferry to go to my second destination that I realized I had to buy another ticket because the first place had lied to me. So that's just one thing you have to be careful of. My advice for that is do research and then do extra research just to be fully prepared for what you might run into while you're traveling. So my first night, I stayed in the small port town of Phuket. It's on a lot of Instagram places because it has a few nice beaches. But the hostel I actually ended up staying in was really unique. It was made out of all plywood, at least the interior was, so it had that like treehouse kind of vibe to it. Now Phuket has some really nice areas, but the day that I was just staying there overnight, it was super rainy, cloudy, overcast. And I didn't really know exactly where I was in the town/city, so I didn't really want to go and venture out and then get lost in a place I couldn't speak the language. So I stayed in that night, made chicken rice for dinner from the local grocery store down the street, and then just edited photos the rest of the night. Then just by coincidence with this monkey theme shirt, the first time I actually got sick while traveling on this trip was when I was at Phuket. The next morning I woke up to have breakfast and I wasn't super hungry, so I had a granola bar and then a banana that they had there for you to eat before you leave. And it was the banana that got me. About an hour after I ate the banana while I was waiting for someone to come pick me up, I feel my stomach start to turn. And then minutes later I was puking banana out of my nose. And I was just kind of frustrated because I was sitting there thinking like, how would a banana be the thing that gets me? The fruit that's wrapped in itself, how could that be bad? But it turned out that's what got me. The banana caused me to puke up my breakfast, and then I set out on the rest of my day. So the ferry ride to get to the Phi-Phi Islands is about an hour long away from Phuket. And basically you spend most of the time just kind of staring out into the open ocean because there's nothing to see. And then slowly you'll start to see these single large green islands just slowly start to emerge. And that's a sign that you're getting closer, because eventually you'll start to see some larger and larger ones, and then you'll reach Phi-Phi, Phi-Phi. I'm going to mispronounce it plenty of times. You'll eventually get to the port, you'll walk out and be greeted by a wave of people demanding money from you. Now apparently there's a small tax that tourists have to pay to get onto the island. It's really not that much, it comes out to the equivalent of like $10 to $15, but it's much better to just pay it because there's really no way around them because they're blocking off the dock. And also another thing to note, the island town of Phi-Phi is like a maze. There are streets, but it's very difficult to navigate after a while. It's super easy to get lost, especially at night. There were a few times where I was trying to figure out how to get back to the small hotel that I was staying at, and it took me half an hour to get there when you can walk from end to end of the small town in 5 minutes. So if you're going to be out drinking, because it is a party town, make sure you remember the landmarks of the places that you're at so you don't get lost and end up in the wrong spot. So if you're exploring the island of Phi-Phi, the shape of the island is kind of like a barbell. It's thick at the end, very thin in the middle, and the thin part is where the town is, with a beach on each side actually, which is pretty cool. One side has all the fancy boats that you see, and then the other side is where most people will go and just hang out and swim and sit on the beach. Now, one of the spots you can go to on one side of the island is where the tsunami / like flooding area is, where all the locals would go up in case of an emergency. But up at the top are 3 different lookouts that give you a sweet panoramic view of the island. I recommend the second one is the best, especially if you get up on the high platform, because then you can get a full look with nothing really obtrusive in the foreground. It's definitely the best one. The third overlook's a little bit overrated. Second one's definitely the best. So this is just a side note to remind you guys, if you're working with a hard drive, be super careful when you're traveling with it or where you're working on it with. A lot of the photos that I had of Thailand were on this hard drive, and unfortunately it did crash because it fell off one of my desks and broke. So some of the photos I'm showing are just the few that I have left that were on another hard drive, or they're just very poorly pixelated ones I could pull off of Facebook or Instagram. So slight reminder, back up your stuff and be careful where you're working with your very fragile hard drives. So after Phi-Phi, the islands, I went to Krabi from the ferry. Now this was just more of a travel day. I was really just trying to get to the next place to get me closer to an airport for my flight to Bangkok. Now Krabi is another place a lot of people like to go to party. It's got some nice temples, but the one night I was there, it's another very overcast and rainy day. I had the sandwich the one nice tropical day while I was on the island taking photos, thankfully. But while I was in Krabi, I was really craving some comfort food from home. So just by coincidence, the place right next to where I was staying had a KFC, had a Dunkin' Donuts, and a pizzeria. So I had KFC for lunch, and then I had donuts and a giant pizza for dinner. Then I watched the Food Network. And honestly, the Food Network is probably one of the best shows to watch abroad because it's honestly very entertaining. And sometimes they'll have specials about the food in the place you're staying at too. And then just spent the rest of the night editing photos, preparing for the next part of my trip. Just to give you guys a quick heads up, when you're traveling to different countries in Southeast Asia, like Singapore or like Thailand, when you go into the major cities, especially through a plane, they'll list off all the things that you can't do in the city or the things you can't bring in. For example, if you litter, you could go to jail. If you vandalize, you go to jail. If you try to bring drugs into the country, you can get killed. So don't do dumb stuff when you're traveling. Try to stick to the rules and you'll have a great time. Now, back down to the video. So when I got to Bangkok, I used Sunil's advice from the last video. I used GrabCar to get to my hotel. Now I did stay in a hotel when I was in Bangkok. I learned from my mistake in Auckland that it's better to stay in a nicer spot when you're closer to the city. You'll just have a better outlook of the city going forward if you do that. Now, when I was in Bangkok, the main goal is to see all the big fancy temples that they have throughout the city. The first one I wanted to go to is the Wat Arun. It's on the other side, so I just took another GrabCar to it. Super simple ride. GrabCar wants to sponsor me, I'll go travel for you. But the temple is pretty awesome, it's huge, it's a lot to walk around. Then there's a bunch of other temples and sites to see around it, so it's very easy in Bangkok to walk from one place to another. They even have water taxis that help you cross the river back and forth. One thing to keep in mind is when you're actually going to these very religious and holy sites is that you can't have your shoulders exposed and you can't have your knees exposed. So when it's the middle of the summer and most guys are probably wearing tank tops and shorts like I was that day, thankfully all the vendors, they're selling all the fancy like linen clothes that have elephants and animals and temples and little Buddhas stitched into them. So I was able to snag a pair of the influencer pants that almost every single girl has. That's just elephants top to bottom, that kind of look like thin sweatpants. Then I thought I would just wear my raincoat through the temples just to have my shoulders covered. And that was a mistake because it got so hot and humid in Bangkok. When I had my raincoat fully on and encompassed throughout me, I started just sweating bullets throughout that whole thing. And unfortunately, it's a waterproof material, but I somehow just left a stench to it that I could never fully get out of. So now it's my secondary raincoat. It's got a little slight kind of like stench to it, but it's very hard to tell and you'll only noticeable if I say something. Now when you try to photograph the areas, especially these temples inside the city, you do have to pick and choose your battles. They're going to be so overcrowded that you're going to be shooting up a lot of the times, just trying to make sure you don't get shots of anyone in it. Or you'll probably be standing there for an hour or two trying to make a composition, just taking photos anytime a person moves an inch. If you try to take a photo of yourself, it's going to be very difficult if you're not within a few feet of your camera because you don't just want to sit down on a tripod and walk away from it because it might not be there when you turn around. Thankfully at the Wat Arun, I found a small group of girls that I took a few photos for them because they wanted a few and they returned the favor for me. So I did get a few photos of myself kind of playing around with the temple architecture. But besides that, you're going to be in for a long day taking photos, or you're just gonna have to understand that all your photos are going to be shot from the ground up, just so you're avoiding the crowds of people below at the street level. So I was very lucky in the sense that I did at least have one raincoat on me that day, because after I got done walking through the King's Palace temples, I got totally dumped on by a thunderstorm. I had to spend about 20 minutes hiding underneath an arch of one of the walls as this storm just dumped buckets of water straight down onto the ground. Then afterwards, I walked through Chinatown just soaking wet, trying to find a few cool photos before I kind of gave up and took a grab car back to my hotel. And as I was walking around, I found this cool alleyway that's actually a river. I was trying to set up my camera to take a photo here. But as I was doing that, someone walked out from underneath the bridge and tried talking to me, and that just kind of threw me off. So I packed up my stuff really quickly and started walking away. And then once I turned around and realized they weren't following me anymore, I went back to my spot, quickly set up my camera to take the photo. Turned out to be a cool leading lens kind of shot. And then tried to get my way through Chinatown a little bit more, tried to take a few other photos of just the environment of the city on a wet kind of day. Then eventually just called a grab car, went back to my hotel. So the next morning, packed my bag, went to the airport, and got on with the next leg of my trip. But I want to get to the part that you might be wanting to know of. One of the most important factors about traveling is the price breakdown, especially for my week in Thailand. So for a full week, about 5 days visiting places, 2 days traveling, I spent about $40 to $45 in hostels and about $245 for the 2 nights in the hotel in Bangkok. For food, I spent between $90 to $100 really, buying food and drinking some beer. And I spent about $100 in just transportation, that's ferry fees and taxi fees. Then I spent probably another $12 in souvenirs, $16 in entrance fees, just the fees to get into the temples I went to. Then the flight was about $245. That's only because I was flying a country right next to Thailand. Depending on where you are in the world, the flight costs will be completely different. If you're using American money, one thing to remember is that our dollar is 33 times stronger than their baht. I think it's BAHT. So one of our dollars is 33 of their dollars. So when something feels like it's 500 or 600 baht, it's only between like $15 to $20 US. So it really isn't that bad. A week in Thailand is super affordable, actually, compared to some places in the US. From the photographer's perspective of Thailand, I wish I had more time to travel. There's a lot of other cool places in Thailand I really wanted to go see, but I only had time to fit in a week for how I originally scheduled myself. I was traveling around with my camera body, 24 to 70, and a tripod. In hindsight, I really wish my drone didn't break because it would have been sick to get some overhead drone shots while I was traveling around the island area. Then if you had the ability to bring a portrait lens of some really cool people on the streets, if you were confident enough to do some street photography, or even maybe a longer, like a 70 to 200 if you just didn't want to approach someone but you wanted to get a cool up close shot of some of the locals. Some interesting street life. There's a lot of variety in the city of Bangkok, so you could have a nice time doing almost anything. And that kind of wraps up my travel video on Thailand. So let me know your thoughts. If you know of anyone who likes Thailand or has been, feel free to share this with them. I'd love to know their thoughts on it. If you like these videos, give it a thumbs up, give it a like. It helps me make them more. Kind of lets me know if I'm talking about the things that you might want to be interested in. But as always, let's recap.